Hi, today's topic is on predestination and the question of does the Bible address the issue of predestination? And yes, it does in several places. I think a good definition for predestination as we get into the texts here is this notion that God ordains beforehand, before the foundation of time, if you will. Predestination and election are very much the same. In some ways, you might say election just states that God chooses those to salvation. Predestination is almost about when does God choose, and He does it before the foundation of time. So for the most part, that's, I think, how those two can best be related. So predestination is this understanding that God has chosen those to salvation before the foundation of time. So let's take a look at a few texts that seem to imply that, or indicate that explicitly, I should say. There are some texts that talk about it very overtly. For example, Romans 8:28-30. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to His purpose. For those whom He foreknew, He also predestined to be conformed to the image of His Son, in order that He might be the firstborn among many brothers. So there we see predestination explicitly detailed. We can also turn to Romans 9, verses 11-13, where it says, though they were not yet born and had not done anything good or bad, in order that God's purpose of election might continue, not because of works, but because of Him who calls, she was told, the older will serve the younger, as it is written, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. We can also turn to Ephesians 1, which is kind of the classic, I think the classic passage for where we get this notion of predestination, where Paul talks about this right at the beginning, lays the groundwork for a very important text for us. Let me get there real quickly. Ephesians 1, starting at verse 4, even as He chose us in Him before the foundation of the world, that we should be holy and blameless before Him. In love, He predestined us for adoption as sons through Jesus Christ, according to the purpose of His will. So we have these mentions of predestination explicitly and implicitly. Another place one can look is Acts 13:48. We won't go there right now, but that's more of an implicit understanding of God choosing without using the word predestination. So it shows up explicitly, implicitly, and so it's impossible to avoid. It is there, and I think we need to accept that God's sovereignty does reign over salvation. So what does that mean for the Christian? I think the first thing that means for us is that we should be humbled. God reveals in many places, such as Psalm 38, Jonah 2:9, also in Revelation 7:10, that salvation belongs to the Lord. It doesn't belong to us. Salvation belongs to the Lord. It also reveals to us that God is a God of grace. For you have been saved by grace through faith, not by works. It is God's grace that saves us. So in order for God to be most gracious, He has to be the one responsible for our salvation. Hence His sovereignty, and predestination fits right into God's sovereign hand involved in our own salvation. I think accepting predestination should also give us comfort in evangelism. For example, Paul says in 2 Timothy 2:10, he says, I endure all things for the sake of the elect, which means he knows that God is the one who is choosing. God is the one who is calling and making people saved, as it were, saving them from His own wrath. But at the end of the day, we're still supposed to be out there sharing the gospel and doing what God has called us to do. Not with any concern that we're the ones saving, but that only God will save. So that should give us comfort as we share the gospel, knowing that God is sovereign over it and it's not resting upon our own efforts to save. Finally, I think it should promote evangelism for that very reason. We know that God is the one doing it, and He's called us to share the gospel. Let me read to you from J.I. Packer's classic book, Evangelism and the Sovereignty of God, as one way of sort of emphasizing this point that knowing that God predestined should encourage us and promote us to share the gospel. J.I. Packer writes, I shall try to show further that so far from inhibiting evangelism, faith in the sovereignty of God's government and grace is the only thing that can sustain it. For it is the only thing that can give us the resilience that we need if we are to evangelize boldly and persistently and not be daunted by temporary setbacks. I think that's stated very well. So trusting in God's sovereignty from predestination and election and the rest should encourage us, comfort us, and promote evangelism. We have 5 of these books available in our cafe bookstore. So if you are at Rock Valley Chapel and hearing this devotional, let me encourage you to go ahead and purchase this book and be encouraged by the truth that God's sovereign hand will give us comfort and should encourage us to share the gospel even more. Thank you, and God bless you.